Welcome back, everybody, to Doc Vats. We like to get into the nitty-gritty here, give you evidence-based info on sports med, whether you're a doc, physio, coach, heck, even an elite athlete yourself. And today we're going deep on something that's, well, it's crucial for athlete well-being,
Yeah.
but doesn't get talked about enough,
Yeah.
harassment and abuse in sports.
Yeah. It's a big one. And unfortunately, it can have a real impact, not just on the field, but off it too.
Right, exactly. And to help us unpack all this, well, it's complicated, right? We've got an expert in athlete safeguarding with us today. Welcome to the deep dive. Now, we're going off of this pretty in-depth document, the IOC, that's the International Olympic Committee, their 2016 consensus statement on harassment and abuse in sport. Don't worry, we've gone through it all the research, so you don't have to. What we want to do is pull out the stuff that really matters, and then, more importantly, figure out what it means for you when you're working with athletes.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really hits you when you read this IOC statement is the focus on, well, they call it safe sport. Basically, every athlete, they have the right to participate in an environment that's free of any kind of violence or abuse. Sounds simple enough, right?
You'd think so, but in reality, a lot of athletes, especially as they as they get more competitive, they face situations that are anything but UT. Research even shows that the higher up an athlete goes, the more likely they are to experience psychological violence or physical or even sexual violence.
Yeah, and that's one of the most worrying things about all of this. It's not just the obvious stuff, the physical abuse, which we all know is wrong. The IOC, they go deeper. They look at other kinds of abuse that can be just as damaging, even if they're harder to see.
So give us an example. What are some of those less obvious forms of abuse?
Well, let's start with psychological abuse. Think of it like this. It's kind of the basis for all the other types of abuse. When you've got a coach who's always putting an athlete down, undermining their confidence, isolating them from the team, it's like it wears down their defenses. And then that psychological damage, well, it can make them more open to other types of abuse later on.
It's almost like setting them up for abuse by breaking down how they see themselves.
Exactly. And it often gets hidden behind, phrases like tough coaching or pushing athletes to their limits. But there's a line, a real line, between demanding excellence and being abusive. And that line, sadly, it gets crossed way too often.
The IOC statement, they also highlight sexual harassment and abuse. Right?
Oh, absolutely. And the research shows it's way more common than people think, especially in elite sports. It can be anything from inappropriate comments or unwanted advances all the way to, in the worst cases, sexual assault. The power dynamics in sports, they can make athletes feel especially young athletes, feel like they can't speak up.
That's really concerning. And the report also talks about neglect as a form of abuse. Can you explain what they mean by that?
So neglect is basically failing to meet an athlete's basic needs. Think about things like proper nutrition and hydration, especially when they're training hard, enough rest and recovery time, and making sure they get the right medical care when they're injured. It's surprising how often these basic things get overlooked, particularly with young athletes who are still, growing and developing.
So it's not just about what's being done to you, an athlete, but also what's not being done to make sure they're okay, to ensure their well-being.
Exactly. And then you've got hazing. We see this a lot in team sports where rookies or younger players, they have to go through these rituals that can be dangerous or humiliating. And the thing is, a lot of this abuse, even the more subtle stuff, it happens right out in the open.
You're right. And it feels like that whole win-at-all-costs mentality, the one that's so common in sports, it can actually create a culture where people they look the other way. They ignore these issues.
The IOC, they call this the bystander effect. And it's a really important point. Even just seeing abuse and not doing anything about it, well, it reinforces that harmful culture. It sends the message that this behavior, it's okay.
And that's why it's so important that everyone in sports, from the doctors and physios to the coaches, even the athletes themselves, that they can recognize the signs of abuse and know how to, step in and do something.
Yeah, and the IOC statement, they really push that. They give specific recommendations for different people involved on how to identify abuse, how to prevent it, and how to respond to it.
Okay, so we've talked about the types of abuse. But what about the impact on the athletes themselves? What happens to them when they experience these things?
The impact can be, it can be devastating. It affects their whole life, their physical health, their mental health, how they perform, their overall well-being. We're talking about anxiety, depression, eating disorders, even suicidal thoughts.
It's awful to think about what these athletes go through.
And then there are the physical effects. Think about chronic pain, injuries that just don't seem to heal right, or even long-term illnesses that are linked to stress and trauma. Some athletes, they turn to substance abuse to cope with the pain, both physical and emotional.
And their careers in sports, they can be completely derailed.
Exactly. Imagine an athlete comes to you with an injury and it just won't go away. And behind that injury, there's this whole story of abuse that they haven't felt able to talk about. They might have to quit their sport completely, lose sponsors, miss out on amazing opportunities. Their whole future can change because of what they've been through.
It really makes you think about what our role is, doesn't it? As
Yeah.
doctors, physios, coaches, we're often the first people these athletes see. We're in a position to, to see the signs and maybe step in early.
Exactly. We need to be more than just like performance boosters. We need to be looking out for their well-being.
Absolutely. But it's not all bad news, right?
Yeah,
There are things we can do to make sports safer for athletes.
that's right. The IOC statement, it's not just about pointing out the problems. It gives really clear guidelines for everyone involved in sports, organizations, healthcare providers, the athletes themselves, on how to create that safe sport environment we were talking about.
So it's not just about protecting athletes from harm, but about building a whole sports culture that's healthy, respectful, and fair for everybody.
Exactly. And the IOC, they really emphasize the importance of everyone working together. If we all follow these recommendations, we can start to break down that culture of silence, the one that lets abuse happen in the first place.
So where do we even start? What are some of the key things the IOC recommends in this statement?
Well, the IOC statement, it really lays out this like multi-pronged approach. It's not just about reacting when something bad happens. It's about trying to stop it from happening in the first place.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? What are some of the things the IOC recommends?
Well, the first thing is awareness, right? Sports organizations, they need to have clear policies, clear procedures that say, straight up, harassment and abuse, that's not allowed, period. And they need to lay out the consequences for anyone who breaks the rules.
More sweeping it under the rug.
Exactly. They also need to have ways for people to report abuse and to get help. If an athlete sees something or experiences it themselves, they need to know exactly what to do, who to talk to. It's about making sure athletes feel safe coming forward.
Right, that makes sense. But just having policies, that's not enough. How do we actually make sure those policies lead to real change?
That's where education comes in. The IOC, they really emphasize how important it is to have these education programs for everyone, athletes, coaches, parents, administrators, medical staff, everyone.
So like giving people the tools to identify abuse, prevent it, and respond to it.
Exactly. It's not just about recognizing the obvious stuff like physical abuse. It's also about understanding the more subtle signs, like psychological abuse.
Right.
And those behaviors that can like groom someone for abuse that often come before the more serious stuff. For those of us working directly with athletes, this is crucial.
We're the ones who see them regularly, right? We can observe their physical and emotional state.
Exactly. We might be the first ones to notice changes in their behavior, how they're performing. That could indicate something's wrong.
So it's about creating this environment where everyone feels like they can speak up, they can intervene if they see something that's not right.
Absolutely. And another big thing the IOC talks about is giving athletes a voice in all of this. It's not just about making policies for athletes. It's about making policies with athletes. They need to be part of the solution.
Yeah, that makes sense. They're the ones who are actually experiencing the sports culture firsthand.
Exactly. And there's this line in the IOC statement, it really stuck with me. It says, educated and ethical entourage members are key to the performance success of athletes.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that mean? Especially for, those of us in sports medicine.
It means we have to realize how much influence we have on these athletes. As doctors, physios, trainers, we're not just there to fix their injuries, we're part of their support system.
Yeah.
How we act, how we behave, how we communicate with them, how we respect their boundaries. All of that, it affects the culture of the team and their individual experience.
It's about realizing our role goes beyond just the physical side of performance.
Yeah, exactly. We need to be aware of the power dynamics, our own biases, and just be careful about how our words and actions can affect an athlete's well-being.
So it's about fostering this culture of respect, open communication, trust. But what if, even with all of that, an athlete does tell us about abuse? What do we do then? What are the next steps?
That's a really important question, and it's something we need to be prepared for. So, responding to disclosure, it requires what's called a trauma-informed approach. The IOC statement, it really stresses how important it is to believe the athlete, to support them, and to make sure they're safe above everything else.
It sounds like how we react initially can really affect how the athlete recovers.
It can, definitely.
Yeah.
If we react negatively or dismissively, It can actually re-traumatize the athlete and make them less likely to ask for help in the future. But if we respond with compassion and support, well, it can empower them to start healing.
So what do we actually DO when an athlete discloses abuse? What does this trauma-informed approach actually look like?
It's about, first and foremost, listening, really listening,
Hmm.
and not judging. Let the athlete tell their story at their own pace, and let them know that you believe them, that you're there for them.
And every athlete, every situation, it's different, right? There's no one way to handle this.
Exactly. And the next step is to connect that athlete with the right support. This could be a counselor, a therapist, a social worker, even legal help if it's a criminal matter.
It seems like we need to think about all aspects of support, right? It's not just the emotional and psychological impact. What about their sports career, their education, their finances? All those things can be affected too.
You're absolutely right. It's about working with the athlete, creating a plan that addresses their specific needs and helps them deal with the challenges they're facing.
The IOC statement, it also talks about having a neutral way to resolve things when abuse happens.
Right. So if the abuse involves someone within the sports organization, there needs to be a process for investigating, for figuring out what happened,
Hmm.
and it has to be fair, impartial.
So like disciplinary procedures or grievances or even mediation.
Yeah, it could be all of those things. The important thing is to have a system that's transparent, that everyone can access, and that makes sure the outcome is fair and unbiased.
This deep dive, it's really been eye-opening. It's clear we need to be doing more, being more proactive to protect athletes from abuse. It's a big responsibility, but we can't ignore it.
I agree. These issues, they're tough, they're complicated, but we can tackle them. If we work together, if we follow the IOC's recommendations, if we build a culture of awareness, of accountability, we can make sports safe, healthy, and fair for everyone.
It's not just about reacting after the fact. It's about creating a culture where abuse is less likely to happen in the first place.
Exactly. We need to move away from silence and towards open communication, respect, support. We need to empower athletes to speak up, and we need to be ready to listen and then act.
This has been such a valuable conversation. Thank you so much for being here today, for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. I hope this encourages everyone listening to think about their own role in making sports safer. We all have a part to play.
And for our listeners, we'll have links to the full IOC statement and other resources on athlete safeguarding on our DocVats website. Go check them out. Think about what you can do to make a difference in your own world, because protecting athletes, that's on all of us. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time on DocVats.